delighted to welcome you to the seminar series on ethical issues in organ transplantation. Our speaker today is Robert Veatch, one of the leading spokespersons in the area of organ transplantation, its history, its ethics, its philosophy. Bob and I met each other, we were just talking, in the fall of 1975. Bob was already the senior associate at the Hastings Center in New York, and I had been invited as sort of a young squirt to join one of the discussion groups that had been ongoing since 1970. So Bob and I go back, I can't count the years, but it's a couple of them. Dr. Veatch is a professor and former director of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University, as well as a professor of philosophy at Georgetown. He earned his PhD in religion and society with a particular focus on medical ethics from Harvard. He's been a major discussant on most of the important ethical issues that have occurred in the last 30 or 40 years, including serving as an ethics consultant on the Karen Quinlan case and the Baby Kate case. Since 1988, Bob has been a member of the governing board and the medical advisory committee of the Washington Regional Transplant Community. He served many terms on the UNOS board on the ethics committee, at least 4 such terms. Dr. Veatch is an active author and editor of books and articles. He's currently serving as a senior editor of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. He's allowed me to say, although over the objections of Dr. Laney Ross, that a book that Bob wrote about 10 years ago called Transplantation Ethics is being planned for a second edition. And in fact, this morning, as Dr. Veatch met with Dr. Ross, they began to think of working together on doing the second edition of Transplantation Ethics. So it's been one of the foundational books in the field of transplantation and ethics. It's a delight to welcome Bob back to speak today on organ transplant, emerging controversies. Join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Veatch.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you to share in this discussion of the ethics of organ transplantation. As I understand it, we're early in the series, and my task is going to be to give you a sampling of several of the controversies that are emerging as we speak. Dr. Siegler indicated that Dr. Ross has been recruited to co-author the second edition of my book. She's more than recruited. We've got her signed up, and we now have many witnesses so that she won't be able to get out of the assignment. For those of you who are old hand at transplant, you know the story and what drives much of the ethical conversation. The donors that are available are growing ever so slowly, but the listings, this graph shows kidneys, the number of listings increases rapidly each year. The wait time is increasing, and although it may be stabilizing somewhat, the shortage of kidneys for transplant shows substantial evidence over the years of increasing mortality while on the wait list. My job is to sketch out for you the ethical issues that this generates for your future discussion as this series progresses. The ethics of organ transplantation divides rather nicely into three major topics: the defining of death, the procurement of organs, and the allocation of organs. Let me say a word about each of the three. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I was a student of Henry Beecher, the chairman of the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee that produced the major American contribution to a brain-oriented definition of death. At the time, we thought that was the easy part of the ethics of transplantation. It would take a few years until the old romantics got over their attachment to the heart, but surely very soon we'd have unanimity on a brain basis for pronouncement of death. That turns out not to have been the case. In fact, we've encountered more and more confusion, so that even though I was clear in 1968 what it meant for someone to die, I am less and less clear to the point that today I find utter confusion. The starting point has been the almost universal acceptance of the dead donor rule, that one cannot procure from humans life-prolonging organs until the donor is dead. Back in 1968, we realized that some people who are considered alive nevertheless seem to be appropriate candidates for organ procurement. So we developed two strategies for dealing with this problem. One was to make exceptions to the dead donor rule for those with dead brains, or those who are permanently unconscious, or maybe the terminally ill, but nevertheless stick to the traditional definition of death. The logic of this is that it would require, if we are procuring organs from those who are still alive, the intentional killing by means of organ procurement. Almost nobody thought this was a plausible idea. It hit up against the strong moral and legal prohibitions on intentional killing. And for most of the last 40 years or so, the dead donor rule has been accepted without equivocation. Within the last year, a very sophisticated book by a physician and a philosopher, Robert Trug from Harvard and Frank Miller from the NIH, the philosopher. They have now published a book entitled Death, Dying, and Organ Transplantation, which is a full-blown defense of the claim that we should revert to the traditional definition of death, death by cardiocirculatory or somatic criteria, but then make exceptions to the dead donor rule, particularly for the class of patients who have made decisions to withdraw from life support, or have had decisions made for them by their surrogate decision makers. So the permanently unconscious, the persistently vegetative patients, more or less the same patients who are dead by brain criteria today, would, if we take physician Robert Trug and philosopher Frank Miller seriously, would be called once again as living patients, but it would be acceptable to procure their organs. We're seeing more and more rigorous philosophical challenges, both to a brain-oriented definition of death and to the dead donor rule. Quite obviously, if they can pull off both of the arguments, we get more or less the same organs we're getting today. In fact, since this would apply to the persistently vegetative, or at least those in irreversible coma, we would probably end up getting more organs. The downside of their proposal from a practical point of view is if they can succeed in convincing the public to revert to a somatic definition of death, but can't convince them that it's okay to kill with the consent of the organ source, the donor, to kill by organ procurement, will lose most of the organs that are available today. So it's a high-risk strategy, but one that is being more and more seriously considered. It is driven prior to their work by a physician neurologist, Alan Schumann from Los Angeles, a very sophisticated physician philosopher who has argued that people really aren't dead just when they lose brain function, and we should revert to a somatic or a cardiocirculatory definition of death. The most recent President's Council entertained that question seriously, and a minority view from the President's Council, in fact, adopted that view. If we don't go that route, and many of us think we should not, then the alternative is, as we found in 1968, to change the definition of death to a brain-based definition. Again, we thought we understood what it meant for somebody to be dead by brain criteria. And increasingly, we're discovering that we're really not so sure precisely what we mean. There are, in fact, three formulations of a definition of death that need to be distinguished. The one that most of you have been nurtured on is generally referred to as the whole brain-based definition, where there is death pronounced when there is an irreversible loss of bodily integrating capacity. The widespread assumption was bodily integrating capacity is controlled by the brain, and therefore when the brain is gone, you've lost this critical capacity, and death should be pronounced. We now know this standard view that most of us have held for most of our work in organ transplant is increasingly suspect, and it's being challenged from both the left and the right. There are no good data on exactly how many people hold the literal whole brain definition of death. My guess, and it's nothing more than a guess based on a group of surveys that all have problems with them, I would guess that it is a large minority of people who hold to the whole brain view, maybe 40 to 45% of persons, in spite of the fact that it is currently the law in all U.S. jurisdictions, and in fact in most jurisdictions in the world. It is being aggressively challenged on the left from those who hold it just doesn't make any sense to say that if there's even one brain function left, then integrating capacity is left and we should treat the individual as a living human being. Can it really be that a person is dead if all brain function is gone, but the person is classified as a living human being if all he has is a gag reflex? That can't be the essence of human life. It must be something more complex than that. There is another large minority, including many neurologists and many philosophers who've spent careers working on this question, who hold to a group of views called the higher brain view that is roughly related to cerebral function, or more specifically to mental function, probably consciousness, so that if you have irreversibly lost capacity for mental function or consciousness, then it's appropriate to reclassify that individual as having being no longer alive. Again, I would estimate if we can get people to understand the difference between the literal whole brain view and the higher brain view, roughly a large minority of people hold to the higher brain view. The practical payoff of this position is those who are permanently unconscious, irreversibly comatose, and those who are persistently vegetative would, by this definition, be reclassified as deceased, and by the way, for anybody interested in organ transplant, a candidate for organ procurement. That represents, I believe, a large minority, at least of the thinking public, as well as professionals in the field. Meanwhile, on the right, there is the Schumann-Trug-Miller view that argues we should revert to a cardiocirculatory or a somatic view, the minority view of the President's Council, and a view increasingly held by a small group of very sophisticated people. Let me share with you the results of a study that was done a few years ago by Laura Siminoff and her colleagues based at Case Western Reserve. They published this a number of places, including in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. Laura Siminoff is a first-rate social scientist who did an empirical survey of 1,351 ordinary citizens of the state of Ohio. We all understand today why she would pick Ohio as a typical centrist bellwether state. She developed 3 case studies that identified whole brain, a patient who was dead by whole brain criteria, a second patient who was in permanent coma, and a third person in persistent or permanent vegetative state. She did all the things social scientists are supposed to do to pre-test, to make sure that she could describe these 3 kinds of patients so that the ordinary citizen could understand the differences among them. She then asked some questions, the first of which, is this patient dead or alive according to your view? As you might expect, she found that most people came to the conclusion that the person who had lost all brain function was indeed dead. 86% thought that such an individual would be dead. That's consistent with my view that roughly 10 to 15% of the public retains a more somatic definition of death. What she also found was that 57% considered the person in permanent coma to be dead, even though that person would not legally be dead in any jurisdiction in the world today. And even 34% considered the person in a permanent vegetative state, the Terry Schiavo or Karen Quinlan sort of patient, to be dead. So a small majority considered this patient dead. A large minority considered the permanent vegetative state patient to be dead. She then asked, of those of you who think the patient is dead, would it be okay to procure organs if you had consent from that patient? Now, you would predict most people would agree with that. There would be a small minority who had idiosyncratic reasons for objecting to organ procurement, religious reasons or whatever, and that's more or less what she found. 1,128 out of 1,164 would procure organs once they've determined the patient would be dead, and likewise, most of the persons who thought the permanent coma patient was dead, and most of the persons who thought the persistent vegetative state patient was dead. So far, so good. But then she asked a rather perverse question that most of us had not thought about, at least until we read Trugan Miller. Of those of you who think these patients are alive, would you accept the procurement of organs with the patient or surrogate's consent? And lo and behold, rather substantial numbers favored procurement while the patient was still alive. 125, you have to subtract the 1164 from the 1351. You'll see that there's a substantial number here in each case that would accept procurement while the patient was alive. Now, if you were to combine these two answers, you'd get the total number who would favor organ procurement, and 93% would favor organ procurement, even though some of these persons thought that the patient was still alive. 74% would favor organ procurement, aggregating the two numbers from the permanent coma patient. And even in the persistently vegetative patient, a small majority, 55%, would consider the patient alive. For the defenders of the most liberal view, favoring procurement from the persistently vegetative patient, you see an interesting political dilemma. You've got a majority in favor of procurement, but in neither case do you have an agreement on the argument that would be used, with a minority that would favor procurement because they thought the patient was dead, and another minority who would favor procurement even though they thought the patient was alive. Well, that gives you a sense that even this old topic of the definition of death that we thought was all taken care of turns out to be still controversial and confusing to people in the profession as well as to lay people. You might at this point say, well, at least we're clear about another part of the definition of death, which holds that you can procure organs from people who are dead by cardiocirculatory criteria. The old non-beating heart donors, the language we used to use, we now talk about them being DCD, with a lot of argument over what those initials stand for. Usually it's donation after circulatory death or donation after cardiac death. Let me share with you the mess we're in on that issue. There was a protocol that was published in the New England Journal in 2008 of a study that was done in Denver that procured hearts from patients, newborns, who were clearly terminally ill. And there was clear permission from parents to procure their organs after life support was withdrawn and the patient was pronounced dead. So the agreement of the parents was not an issue in these cases. They decided to withdraw life support. They awaited cardiac arrest, waited 75 seconds after asystole in the second and third cases, pronounced the death, procured the hearts, reanimated the hearts, transplanted them, and published the wonderful results that these hearts apparently worked fine in the newborn recipients. Wonderful result until you notice where the controversy is. There was a preliminary controversy around the 75 seconds. If you have protocols for DCD in adults, you probably use 5 minutes. If you're radical and you follow the old Pittsburgh protocol, you might wait 2 minutes after asystole. In Denver, even though they were working with newborns for whom we have no data for restarting of the heart, autoresuscitation, they waited only 75 seconds. So that created a controversy in pediatric cardiology. that is only the preliminary problem. The real problem was supposedly they were pronouncing death because there was irreversible loss of heart function. And then they published in New England Journal of Medicine that we had irreversible loss of heart function, and then we restarted the hearts, albeit in a recipient patient. Some of us ask the nasty question, how do you reverse an irreversibly stopped heart? And to this day, we don't know precisely what it means for someone to be dead because of a cardiac arrest. Now, what the Denver people did was say, it's all right, it's really not the heart in DCD that's critical. The C really stands for circulation. So it's donation after circulatory death, not donation after cardiac death. Very conveniently, both of them DCD is the abbreviation. So since there was never any restoration of circulation in the infants who had died and been the organ sources, they thought they were home free until you read in AJT within the last year of another protocol in New York, which attempts to procure hearts after uncontrolled or unplanned cardiac arrest, people who drop dead of a heart attack on the street. The rescue people come, do everything that's possible. In New York, they developed a protocol that lets the rescue team do whatever rescue teams do until they give up. But they would have a second team standing by to maximize the preservation of organs so that DCD from uncontrolled cardiac arrest could be attempted. After the cardiac arrest and death pronouncement, the protocol called for using perfusion and ECMO to preserve organs while the body was being transported to the hospital in the operating room. Again, somebody asked the nasty question, how can it be that you have an irreversible loss of circulation before you restore circulation in that patient, either using perfusion or ECMO? Either way, you're restoring circulation. Of course, their answer was circulation doesn't matter, it's the heart that's important. As long as the heart isn't restarted, and they weren't attempting to procure hearts, they're procuring other organs. They thought they were home free. I take it that you can see that the Denver answer and the New York answer are mutually exclusive. It's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. To give you a quick sketch of an even more difficult complication, in Michigan, they developed a protocol to wait for cardiocirculatory arrest, pronounce death, and then insert a balloon cannula in the carotid arteries before restoring heart function with circulation to the brain blocked. And this would be done with chest compression or ECMO. So there would be a restoration of circulation as opposed to the other two protocols. There would be no restoration of blood flow to the brain. And when somebody pointed out, you're now restoring both heart and circulatory function, they said that really doesn't matter because there is no oxygenation of the brain, and it's the brain activity that is really critical. So now our question is, if we're going to pronounce death by cardiocirculatory criteria, is it the heart or circulation? And what happens if we have circulation to parts of the body but not to other parts of the body? If you merely perfuse the blood vessels of the foot after death, nobody would confuse that with a living human being. But if you perfuse everything in the body except the brain, it's going to depend on whether the purpose of pronouncing death by cardiocirculatory criteria is really as an indicator of the lack of brain function, or whether intrinsically something is important with circulation. So the definition of death has left us with substantial confusions. Let me move on. I've spent more time than I intended on definition of death, so I'll move more quickly here. Organ procurement is also raising a range of issues. In organ procurement, if you look globally at the underlying political philosophy of procurement, there are basically three main philosophical defenses of organ procurement. The first of which is the standard donation model that we use in Anglo-American countries, Northern Europe, Germany, and the like, which is built on a legal theory that an individual possesses what is called quasi-property rights in his body. He doesn't have unlimited use of the body, so for example, he can't sell parts of his body to the highest bidder, but he can control certain decisions, including the procurement of organs. That was the position that won out in the United States, the one you're familiar with today. But in the 1960s, there was an alternative available that was variously termed routine salvaging. Aaron Spital in New York boldly calls it a conscription model. Many of you may hear it referred to as a presumed consent model, where the state would authorize procurement of organs without an explicit consent. Usually this comes with an opt-out, so it's a soft version of salvaging or conscription. But the thing that I find philosophically troubling is that there are two quite independent reasons one might procure organs without an explicit consent. The straightforward idea that's implied in the word conscription or salvaging is all of us are part of a broader society. We're part of a state, and the state has interests that are legitimate. They can do things to us even without our permission. So we are required to pay income taxes. Some of you are old enough to remember a time when there was military conscription, not with the consent of the one who is recruited. Certainly, we don't rely on consent models for our duty to pay income tax and many, many other things that we do out of our obligation to the state. That is the more communitarian kind of defense of organ procurement. But there is also this language of presumed consent. Some of you may be shocked to know there is no country in the world, to my knowledge, that literally has a presumed consent law. Lots of countries in Southern Europe and Asia and Scandinavia have laws that authorize taking of organs without consent. They're generally the Catholic countries or the communitarian countries of socialist Scandinavia that understand the subordination of the individual to the interests of society, but they don't presume the consent of the individual. In fact, presuming the consent of the individual is an empirical question. And we know if we presumed someone's consent for organ procurement, depending on your OPO, you'd be wrong in that presumption in the US at least 25% of the time, maybe as much as 50% of the time. That's too high an error rate to reach a scientifically valid conclusion that we have grounds for believing a random individual would have consented. So presuming consent is, in my mind, a deceptive strategy to take salvaging or conscription and sneak it back into the more attractive donation model. I don't think there's any defense for presumed consent any place in the world. However, I'm willing to entertain a serious philosophical discussion about the legitimacy of salvaging or conscription, provided it's called by that name. In the meantime, we have also seen a second variation on the donation model that moves toward markets. There have been at least 3 major volumes published recently by James Taylor, by Mark Sherry, by T.M. Wilkinson, a New Zealander, all defending quasi-libertarian defenses that would stretch the notion of quasi-property rights and give us more robust property rights, including the right to buy and sell our organs. Dr. Ross and I were talking about how, in fact, even the defenders of free markets seem to be nervous about adopting wholehearted libertarian strategies. They normally put some constraints like a maximum price or tests to see that one is mentally competent and the like. So we have 3 models: the main centrist view of donation, one that deviates in a more communitarian way for routine salvaging, one that deviates in a more libertarian way that would tolerate more markets. We wouldn't be having this discussion were it not for the fact that the donation model, friends, is simply not producing the organs that we need. So we're getting much more serious discussions of policy options that at first didn't sound as plausible. Another procurement topic that I'll mention in passing, we've just taken it up in the UNOS Ethics Committee. You're probably aware that there are now vascularized composite allografts, VCAs, that are producing a lot of excitement. Let me tell you about Richard Lee Norris, a young man who suffered some sort of gun accident that left him looking like this. At the University of Maryland, he was the recipient of a full face transplant that produced this, a picture taken 5 days after his surgery. Obviously, he still has some swelling in the eyes. You can see the surgery lines here that eventually his hair will cover up. Some remarkable things that are being done. Raising questions at the procurement level about explicit consent. In our OPO in Washington, the Washington metropolitan area, we have a consent document that basically asks people to give permission to donate organs and tissues without specification of the detail. And we've now realized if we're going to procure faces or hands, and occasionally we face the similar problem procuring spinal columns and genitalia for research purposes, where even though we have a signed donation for all organs and tissues, we in our OPO have taken the position the typical family doesn't understand by our routine request for permission that we might take face or hands or genitalia. So we have adopted a policy that requires explicit consent for anything beyond the ordinary, anything that might trigger pause on the part of a donor family. We think in the long term, this is not only the morally appropriate thing to do, but will protect the transplant enterprise.
So you're talking, Bob, about family consent, not first-party consent.
Well, we would be hesitant, I can't speak for the whole OPO, but if we had a straight first-person consent for donation of organs and tissues, and we wanted the face or the genitalia, I believe we would not consider the consent adequately informed. I mean, you can make your own judgment about it, but I think the reasonable thing to do would be go to the family and say, we've already got the consent for normal organs and tissues, that's fine, but we could do a lot of good if we could also procure the face. Would you be willing to entertain that? It seems to me adequately informed consent requires explaining that if that wasn't in the mindset of the one who made the original donation decision. There's another interesting twist to vascular composite allografts. Do we do the worst cases or the best cases first? Some surgeons have wanted to do the easiest cases first because they're more likely to work, whereas from an ethics perspective, I think most of us have been inclined to want to do the absolute worst cases, so even if they don't turn out perfectly, we've dealt with someone's problem. This gentleman I showed you had been living as a recluse for several years because of his appearance. There's another woman who was gored by a primate, a friend who had a primate, and the primate attacked her. She'd been walking around with a mask or a veil over her face for years because of the horrific appearance that was produced. So worst cases first seem to make sense. Another interesting problem, most of us in transplant have pretty well gotten over the idea that it would be ethical to discriminate, say, procuring white organs for white recipients and so forth. We attacked that in the directed donation debate of the 1990s. But in the case of face or hand allograft, almost certainly there is good reason to do racial skin tone color matching as well as gender and age matching. So all of us who have been trained for decades on the horrors of racial and gender discrimination are going to have to retool to understand that there may be cases where there would be intentional racial discrimination in donor recipient matching, say in the case of a face. I am told, I assume it's true, that gender and age are also problems as well as race. Okay, some words on allocation. You probably caught in the news that there was a lot of controversy over whether Dick Cheney got special treatment when he rapidly got a heart, incidentally, from the OPO in which I'm on the board of directors. I'm absolutely certain that he, as a candidate with a left ventricular assist device, was very high priority for the heart, and there were no strings pulled. Cheney wasn't the most popular politician in the Washington area anyway. If anybody had pulled strings, who knows what would have happened to the poor man. In any case, people raised the question, is it reasonable that an organ should go to a 71-year-old man? And in fact, we know in heart transplant, more than 10% of organs of hearts have been going to those over 65. This has raised questions about new formulas for allocating kidneys that have been debated now for several years and have come to a head this year with a new proposal from the UNOS Kidney Committee for a new kidney allocation scheme. In the early 80s, we had an allocation formula based on HLA matching. And we adopted it because it seemed like a very useful thing to do to increase graft survival by matching HLA. We discovered during my first term on the UNOS Ethics Committee that one of the unintended consequences of HLA matching was that the allocation had rather substantial implications with regard to race. In particular, Caucasians did well in matching the donor pool such that blacks ended up having wait times as much as twice as long as Caucasians. So we took our utilitarian commitment to HLA matching and adjusted the allocation formula to emphasize fair access by giving much greater weight to time on the waiting list, panel reactive antibodies, and dimensions of that sort. This has worked well, but we have increasingly discovered that giving high emphasis to time on the waiting list has produced an effect that has made our transplant system quite inefficient. In particular, when an organ becomes available, it will go to the person who scores highest on the UNOS algorithm without regard to patient age. So we might get a young, healthy 20-year-old accident victim whose kidneys go to the 70-year-old on the waiting list who will die from normal life expectancy, die with healthy kidneys, not getting the full benefit of those young, healthy kidneys. And the next organ that becomes available from an elderly organ donor might be randomly assigned to a young person. So we've known for a long time that allocation was unfair, and there ought to be some kind of age matching that would increase the efficiency of the system. So we're now swinging back to utility measures, that is, measures of the good outcomes typically measured by increased years of predicted graft survival per organ transplanted. The U.S. law comes into play at this point. The U.S. law specifically requires that UNOS allocate organs taking into account two criteria: efficiency and equity. The efficiency criterion is what philosophers would call a utility measure. The equitable criterion is what philosophers would think of as a justice measure. So in 2012, the kidney allocation proposal focuses on getting the best kidneys into patients with the longest expected post-transplant survival. In the interest of time, I'll go through rather quickly what the new proposal calls for. It's still being debated actively. They first of all calculate a kidney donor profile index made up of these 10 variables. That doesn't work as a pointer. These 10 variables have been built into an algorithm that produces an expected donor profile for 1 and 2 year kidney survival, from 0 percentile being the best up to 100% being the worst. They then calculate an estimated post-transplant survival based on candidate age, dialysis time, prior organ transplant, and diabetes status, where the top 20% of candidates based on estimated post-transplant survival receive the best 20% of donor kidneys based on the kidney donor profile index. So it is, in essence, a modified age matching arrangement, modified by taking into account dialysis time, history of previous transplant, and time on dialysis. The idea is to get the best kidneys into the 20% who have the best estimated post-transplant survival. The remaining 80% are then allocated with priority to highly sensitized patients. We won't use 80% PRA anymore. They're going to much higher percentages of PRA, 99 and 100%, but also taking into account zero mismatch, prior living donation status, with still a priority for pediatric candidates, and finally time on dialysis. The expected outcome is an additional 8,380 additional life years gained annually from our supply of kidneys. Obviously efficient gain in life years. Meanwhile, improving access moderately for these very highly sensitized patients, improving a little bit access for ethnic minorities with comparable levels of kidney transplant at regional and national levels. Hidden from this is the fact that if we'd gone to a more global, a more national list, rather than keeping local kidneys locally, we could have done even much better. A combination of a national list plus age matching would add something like 35,000 additional life years. So if we'd gone to a national list, we would have done even better, but we choose not to. This raises some equity problems. Dr. Ross has been particularly concerned about the huge difference between those in the 19th percentile compared to those in the 21st percentile, essentially the same in terms of estimated post-transplant survival. If you're at the 19th percentile, you get the top 20 organs. If you're at the 21st percentile, you get the dregs, the leftovers, the bottom 80%. There's still going to be some disadvantage to O blood type. Kidney quality will vary from OPO to OPO. Older persons are going to get fewer and worse grafts. That's either defensible or not, depending on your view of what we call fair innings. And diabetics and those with previous grafts will be discriminated against. Even young diabetics who on a straight age matching would do well, but with the estimated post-transplant survival formula, having a history of diabetes is going to count against you. And if you think a diabetic is already twice worse off because they're diabetic and in kidney failure, you're going to see that as inequitable. Dr. Ross and I and others, some of you may know already, have proposed what we call the EOFI, where EOFI stands for Equal Opportunity supplemented by fair innings. We recognize the utility of age matching, but we provide an equity analysis that takes into account equal opportunity. We want to arrange the allocation so that everybody has the same probability of getting some organ, but not necessarily an equally good organ. We want young people to get organs that have the longest life expectancy, because that's what they need. An old person doesn't need a 20-year-old kidney. So we take into account the idea that the worst should have priority based on life expectancy, high CPRA, concomitant disease like diabetes. Also the fair innings argument that gives priority to the youngest. I want to draw this to a close. I'm going to say some more about EOFI. Basically, 6 antigen matches would have priority and high PRA would have priority, but would create 4 recipient age groups, then hold the chance of getting an organ constant over age ranges, but create 4 donor age ranges so the number of organs is proportional to the number of recipients and so forth. The result would be, with EOFI, everybody by age group would have the same chance of getting an organ. That compares to baseline, where old people have a higher probability of getting an organ, and age matching, which means younger people would have a higher probability of getting an organ. I think what I want to do is draw this to a close, so we'll have at least a few minutes for discussion. I had a couple more slides, but I've made the main points I want to make. Turns out definition of death, organ procurement, and organ allocation are all serious ethical problems, and the more we work with them, the more muddled our ethical thinking becomes, so that even if we were clear in 1968 what the ethics was, by 2012 we're not clear at all. Let me just stop at that point and entertain some questions if we have time. Thank
you. Before Mike Millis handles the questions, I want to call the audience's attention to the MacLean Center annual conference. Each week, I think we leave 2 brochures out there, one of which is this one. The first day of the MacLean conference will handle 2 of the issues that Bob spoke about in the first 2 parts of his talk. On the brain death controversy, on Friday, November 9 in the afternoon, Jim Burnett and Bob Trug, who have quite different views on the status of brain death, will not exactly debate, but will offer their different perspectives on the brain death issue.
Burnett is the main defender of whole brain, and Trug is now defending the somatic view combined with the legality of defending the legality of procuring organs.
We'll have the book this year. So you'll hear that on Friday, November 9. The second half of the afternoon will actually be on this topic of vascularized composite allografts. We're going to have Maria Siminoff come, who did the first American face transplant at Cleveland, and Warren Breidenbach will come. Warren did the first American hand transplant at Louisville. And so we're going to be talking in serious ways about the so-called composite or vascularized tissue allografts on that same afternoon. And finally, on Bob's notion about the use of markets, in the seminar series, not next week, but the week after, Gary Becker, who along with Richard Epstein and Sally Sattel have done conferences here on the importance of markets in organ transplant, Gary's going to come over and defend the idea of a market for organs.
He's not the only Nobel Prize winner working on organ transplant.
No longer.
Right.
Al Roth got the Nobel Prize. So I'm going to turn over the microphone to Mike, and Mike will conduct the question and answer.
Thank you very much. And Bob, I would like to thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Sorry I was a little late getting here. I was still in the OR, our usual early starts. So just a comment. I think regardless of the definition one uses, we can come to the conclusion that whoever came up with the protocols in Colorado, Michigan, and New York are ethically brain dead. So.
And they're donors? I have 2 questions. The first has to do with the short comment you made about geographic disparities. And I would add that those geographic disparities are of historical interest because of how the system was developed. Yeah. And where is the controversy about extending the geography beyond transfer of the organs over a little longer distance if you're going to get that much more benefit? And the second question really isn't a question, it's more a comment that now we have 3 ways to die before there's actual death.
Yeah,
and each individual theoretically could go any one of the 3 ways or all of them.
I think I'm still mic'd, I believe. With regard to geography, I think there are 2 things going on. There is legitimate dispute over the efficiencies, and I define efficiency of years of life per organ transplanted. Early defense of local allocation was generally argued on efficiency grounds. Shorter cold ischemia time, a widespread belief without data that people in the community would be more willing to donate if they thought the organs were being used locally. And although they don't make a point about it, if you have local allocation, some organs, like livers, for instance, will go to healthier patients in an OPO that just doesn't have any acute liver failure patient on the list. And that might increase the years of life added by actually transplanting relatively healthier patients. So there's an empirical dispute over what is efficient. I didn't show you the slide, but the same kidney committee that has come up with the new kidney allocation proposal has run 45 or so models, one of which takes longevity matching, more or less the estimated post-transplant survival statistic, and adds to that a national list allocation and shows the number of years of added graft survival rising from 8,000 up to 34,000, I believe the number is. So there seems to be an empirical basis. It's probably not a full, unmodified national list. We really don't need to ship organs from Maine to Hawaii needlessly. But at least regional matching or some geographical area beyond the local OPO. My guess is it's not only an argument about efficiency, but some perceived vested interests in keeping the transplant activity at the local level. The usual mistrust of the anonymous stranger who's using our organs in some distant city. My guess is there's something driven by self-interest of the transplant programs that makes us come down on the side of local allocation.
Based on the statistics, we can determine life expectancy of a person, say 80 years. But how do we determine life expectancy of an organ? For example, suppose a 50-year-old kidney be transferred, how do we know that would not have another 50 or 60 years rather than only life expectancy of a person itself? Because survival of the organ, a lot depends on what other functions in the body exist.
Yeah, as I understand it, what you're raising is essentially a sophisticated empirical question. The kidney donor profile index that I had up on the slide is an empirical measure that presently incorporates the 10 factors that were listed on the left-hand side of the slide. And the claim is from the statistician that in fact that predicts, as well as we can predict right now, the future life expectancy of the organ, assuming the patient doesn't die before the organ fails. I understand it to be strictly an empirical claim. If somebody comes up with an 11th factor, they'll reprogram the computers and recalculate the donor kidney profile index in some other way. I think in principle it makes sense that you don't want kidneys that have a projected very long life to go into a recipient who has a projected very short life. That's common sense that all of us should be willing to accept. But can we do that in a way that is fair? Let me point out the unfairness on the recipient side. I've mentioned to you we take into account history of diabetes in a recipient as an indicator of shorter estimated post-transplant survival. We take into account diabetes, but we don't take into account heart disease. And my understanding, Dr. Ross has helped me a lot on this, my understanding is that's in part because the data are better for the diabetes calculation than for the heart disease. We don't have the data that provide clean predictors based on heart disease. But if we've got an allocation formula that takes into account one disease, diabetes, but doesn't take into account other diseases that in fact may be even more influential, don't we have a discriminatory system? We don't take into account immune status of recipients, things of that sort. Diabetes is a kind of an interesting problem because from an efficiency standpoint, they score low, projected years of life added. But from an equity standpoint, they score very high. Somebody who's multiply worse off because of multiple diseases, or at least two somewhat unrelated diseases.
So Dr. Becker?
Hi, I know the hour runs late, and I'm the current vice chair of the Policy Oversight Committee at UNOS, and I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts about one thing we're going to be tackling is multiple organ allocation. And you mentioned the scarcity of kidneys, which we all know about. Should Dick Cheney have gotten a kidney if he needed a heart kidney?
The UNOS Ethics Committee, has taken up, independently of the kidney proposal, the question of the ethics of multiple organs. There's a kind of simplistic common sense problem. If you've got two organs available that can be transplanted into two people and save two lives, or can both be transplanted into the same person and save one life, from a utilitarian point of view, it's an easy calculation. Multiple organs should get low priority. From an equity standpoint, the fact that you are in need of multiple organs, that per se should not count against you. Now, I am aware, Dr. Ross and I have spent some time talking about this, so has the UNOS Ethics Committee, that there are some multiple organs, kidney, pancreas, kidney, liver, for example, where the person rises to the top of the liver list and then gets a kidney along with it, even though their need for the kidney is debatable. They wouldn't have, maybe wouldn't even have been listed for kidney alone. If it turns out that some multiple organs like liver, kidney are consuming kidneys, and incidentally consuming them in quantities that are larger than we might intuitively think was the case, then it's time to revisit the automatic preempting of kidneys for multiple organ transplant. We're going to have to do it in a way that is fair to those who need multiple organs, but at the same time is not squandering kidneys on people who probably could do okay if they just got a liver. In fact, with a new liver, they might be able to restore kidney function and not need the kidney transplant at all. The Ethics Committee's message is we need to consider both equity and efficiency and not automatically downgrade multiple organ recipients. But at the same time, I believe we've reached the point where we need to re-examine the automatic preempting of organs, kidneys, for multiple organ transplant, taking them in front of kidney alone. The current kidney proposal does not address the multiple organ priority, and we're going to have to do that fairly quickly in order to be fair to everyone on the kidney list.
Yolanda.
In fairness, it's on the agenda for the next meeting.
And on February 13th, in this seminar, Savi Fetson, I don't know if Savi is here this afternoon, is going to speak on the topic, is multi-organ transplantation ethical? Because Savi will come at it from the heart as the primary organ and then think about the additional organs. So that'll be February 13th.
Let me just add real quickly. I wrote up a case of a youngster who received a total of 12 organs. Received 12 organs, including intestine, stomach, kidney, and I can't remember now what all was involved. And then he received 3 sets, so total of 12 organs. 2 of the 4 organs he received each time weren't really scarce. So you don't want to treat that as if it's grossly unfair to somebody who didn't get a small intestine if small intestine wasn't scarce at the time. Likewise, of the 3 sets of 4 that he received, the second set was an emergency transplant of a set of organs they knew in advance weren't any good, but it was an emergency. They did it for a week or two as a bridge to another set of organs. So I wouldn't really count any of that second set of 4 as using up a scarce resource. My point is simply, when you deal with multiple organ transplant, you have to assess for each of the organs the extent to which it raises an equity problem for the allocation of that organ.
Last comment and or question. Elaine?
Well, I was hoping you would actually, since we were talking about multi-organ, also comment about the whole ethics of retransplant.
Yeah. There is a line of thought about retransplant that says everybody should get first before anybody gets seconds. It's the rule for ice cream at dessert. The reason I'm uncomfortable with that, at least as a flat rule, is if we have a policy that says you're entitled to 1 organ, but once you get your 1 organ, you go all the way to the end of the line, basically you're never going to get a second. That creates incentives against using ECDs, organs that aren't of perfect quality. And it is contrary to the interests of the community to discourage the use of ECDs in the case of kidneys or other less than perfect organs. I'm inclined to the view that as far as equity is concerned, having a history of transplant should be irrelevant to where you are on the list. It's a complicated question, but that is tentatively my view with regard to equity. Now, I've also said that with regard to estimated post-transplant survival and efficiency score, we are in fact taking into account a history of previous transplant, not because you've already had first, but because it's a predictor of poor quality, poor graft survival the second time around. It's an intriguing problem in the current kidney proposal. It counts against you that you have a history of a previous transplant, but you shoot to the top of the list if you have high PRA. Now, how do you get high PRA? One of the ways is by having a history of a previous transplant. What it means is if you're lucky enough to have high PRA, but not from a transplant, you're doing very well in the proposal. But if your high PRA is caused by previous transplant, it's going to count against you, at least with regard to estimated post-transplant survival.
Once again, thank you very much. And
thank you.